Welcome to our deep dive today. It's all about protecting your marriage from those sneaky outside influences that can sometimes creep in.
Hmm.
We're going to be diving into a text that lays out 5 principles for safeguarding your marriage.
Okay.
And what's really cool about this text is that it approaches marriage in a really unique way as a three-way covenant,
Okay.
not just between two people, but with God right there in the mix.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this perspective flips the script on how we usually think about protecting a marriage.
Mhm.
It becomes about recognizing this spiritual dimension of the relationship as the core strength. It's not just about keeping other people out.
So it's like instead of building walls to keep people away, you're building a strong foundation that can withstand anything that comes your way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where this first principle comes in, guarding your words.
Okay.
The source specifically says, do not criticize my spouse in front of a third person.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like common sense, right? We all know it's not cool to trash talk your partner, but I have a feeling there's a deeper layer here, something beyond just avoiding a good old-fashioned vent session with friends.
Absolutely. This principle is rooted in Scripture in James 5.9, where it says, do not complain about one another. But beyond the biblical aspect, think about the psychology at play here. When you criticize your spouse to others, you're essentially inviting their opinions and judgments into your relationship,
You're opening the door to outside influences.
right?
That can be really hard to shut out once they're in.
Right. And it can create a cycle of negativity. You vent to a friend, they offer sympathy, or maybe even fuel the fire with their own opinions. And suddenly, you're seeing your spouse through this distorted lens.
So instead of seeking solutions within the marriage, within that covenant with God, you're seeking validation from outside sources.
Yeah.
And those sources don't have the same vested interest in your marriage succeeding.
Precisely. They're not part of that covenant. That's why the source emphasizes turning to God or a trusted Christian mentor when you're facing challenges in your marriage. It's about seeking counsel that aligns with the spiritual foundation of your relationship.
Now, this is where it gets interesting for me. The text specifically calls out women on this one, cautioning against excessive talking and oversharing. And honestly, I can see how that could be a trap. As women, we're often encouraged to be emotionally expressive, to share our feelings. But in the context of marriage, that can be a slippery slope, can't it?
It definitely can be. There's a fine line between healthy communication and oversharing. And I think it goes back to that intention we talked about earlier. Are you sharing your feelings with the goal of strengthening your marriage, or are you seeking validation or sympathy?
That's a good point. It's like you're allowed to vent, but it's about being mindful of who you're venting to and why. And if your venting starts to sound more like gossiping, it might be time to redirect that energy toward finding solutions within your marriage.
Exactly. And I think that's a universal principle, regardless of gender or religious beliefs. Healthy communication is crucial in any relationship, and being mindful of how and where you express your feelings is key.
So let's move on to the second principle, public affirmation.
Okay.
Now, this one really resonates with me. I'm a big believer in celebrating your partner, not just in private, but shouting it from the rooftops.
And there's a biblical basis for that, too. Proverbs 16.24 says, kind words are like honey, sweet to the soul. Publicly affirming your spouse is like showering them with honey.
Okay, but some people might think, isn't that a bit over the top?
Right.
Like, do I really need to gush about my husband every time we're out with friends?
It's not about being over the top or putting on a show. It's about those small, genuine gestures that show your partner you appreciate them. Like maybe you're at a dinner party and someone asks your spouse about their work. You could chime in and say, oh, he's been killing it lately, got a big promotion, and he totally deserves it.
Right. Or even something as simple as leaving a sweet comment on their latest Instagram post.
Yeah.
It's those little things that add up, but what's interesting to me is that this principle goes beyond just making your spouse feel good. It's also about how you present your marriage to the world.
Exactly. Public affirmation is a powerful way to show everyone that you're a team, that you're united, and that unity creates a protective barrier around your marriage.
It's like sending a message to those outside influences that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Hey, we're solid, we're happy, don't even try to mess with us.
Precisely. It's about projecting strength and stability, which makes it much harder for negativity to penetrate. And, there's actually some interesting research on this. Studies have shown that couples who express appreciation for each other publicly tend to have stronger, more satisfying relationships.
So it's not just a feel-good thing, it's backed by science. Okay, so we've talked about guarding our words and public affirmation. What's the next principle in this marriage protection plan?
The third principle is all about prioritizing your spouse's opinion above all others. And this one can be a bit tricky to navigate right, because we all have friends and family members we love and trust. But the source is saying that when it comes to your marriage, your spouse's perspective should come first.
Now, that doesn't mean you shut out everyone else's opinions, right?
Right.
It's more about creating a hierarchy where your spouse is at the top.
You got it. It's about recognizing that your spouse is your primary confidant, your partner in this covenant, and their insights and opinions should carry more weight than anyone else's.
So if you're facing a decision as a couple, you talk to your spouse first, you seek their counsel, and you give their perspective the most consideration.
Right.
And I imagine that sends a powerful message to your spouse, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It demonstrates respect, trust, and a deep level of commitment. It shows them that you value their thoughts and feelings above all others.
And I'm guessing that kind of security within the relationship makes it a lot harder for outside influences to take hold. It's like having a solid foundation that can withstand any storm.
Precisely. When you and your spouse are united, when you're on the same page, you're much less likely to be swayed by external pressures or opinions.
Okay, this is all making so much sense. It's like each principle builds on the last, creating this incredibly strong fortress around your marriage.
That's a great way to put it. It's about layering these principles, weaving them together to create a shield that protects your relationship from those pesky moths that try to nibble away at the fabric of your bond.
So we've got a solid foundation, we're speaking kindly, and we're prioritizing each other's opinions. What's next? How do we tackle those inevitable conflicts that arise in every marriage?
Well, that brings us to principle number 4, and this one is all about presenting a united front, especially in the face of conflict.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with your spouse on everything or pretend like everything's perfect all the time.
Definitely not. Disagreements are inevitable in any relationship, but the key here is how you handle those disagreements, particularly when others are involved. The source emphasizes the importance of supporting your spouse publicly, even if they're wrong.
So it's like you save those difficult conversations for private moments behind closed doors.
Right.
But in front of others, you present a united front, which can be really hard, especially if you're feeling hurt or angry.
It can be challenging, but it's essential. Think of it this way. Imagine you and your spouse are on a boat, sailing through rough waters. If you start arguing and fighting on deck in front of everyone, it creates chaos and instability. You might even capsize the boat.
That's a great analogy. But if you address those issues calmly and privately below deck, you can weather the storm together and keep the boat afloat.
Exactly. And it's rooted in Scripture as well. Ephesians 4:23 talks about being humble, gentle, patient, and bearing with one another in love. It's about recognizing that unity is more important than being right.
So it's like even if you're frustrated with your spouse, you choose to support them publicly, to have their back. And that sends a powerful message both to your spouse and to anyone who might be watching.
Right. It shows that you're committed to working through your issues together, that your bond is strong enough to withstand conflict, and it also discourages outside interference.
Because if someone sees you and your spouse constantly bickering in public, they might be more likely to offer unsolicited advice or try to insert themselves into your problem.
Precisely. But if they see you standing strong, supporting each other, they're less likely to get involved.
Okay, so we're guarding our words, we're affirming each other publicly, we're prioritizing each other's opinions, and we're presenting a united front. What's the final piece of the puzzle when it comes to protecting our marriage?
Well, that brings us to the fifth and final principle, shutting down negativity. And this one is all about being a fierce protector of your marriage, both proactively and reactively.
So it's about recognizing that negativity, whether it's gossip, criticism, or just plain bad vibes, can be toxic to a relationship.
Absolutely. It's like a virus that can spread and infect your marriage if you're not careful. And the source uses a powerful analogy from Proverbs 26:20, which says, without wood, a fire goes out. Without gossip, a quarrel dies.
So gossiping about your spouse or allowing others to speak negatively about them is like adding fuel to the fire of potential conflict.
Exactly. And the source is very clear on this point. You need to be bold in shutting down that negativity. Don't let it take root in your marriage. If someone starts gossiping about your spouse, you cut them off. You say, hey, I don't want to hear that. I'm not going to participate in that.
Now, that can be really hard, especially if it's someone you're close to, like a family member or a friend.
It can be uncomfortable, but it's essential.
Mm.
Remember, you're protecting something precious, something sacred, and you have every right to set those boundaries.
You're essentially saying my marriage is off limits. Don't bring that negativity into our space.
Right. And it's not just about shutting down gossip. It's also about being proactive in creating a positive environment around your marriage.
So surrounding yourself with people who support your relationship, who lift you up, and who speak well of your spouse.
Exactly. It's about being intentional about the influences you allow into your marriage.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored these 5 principles for protecting your marriage: guarding your words, public affirmation, prioritizing your spouse's opinion, presenting a united front, and shutting down negativity. And what's really resonated with me is how each principle is rooted in this idea of a 3-way covenant, a bond between you, your spouse, and God.
And I think what's so powerful about that framework is that it takes the pressure off of you and your spouse to be perfect. It acknowledges that marriage is hard, it's a journey, and you need a source of strength beyond yourselves.
You're not in it alone. You have God as your partner, your guide, your source of wisdom and grace.
And that's where the true protection lies.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I'm already starting to think differently about how I approach my own marriage and the influences I allow into it.
Me too. It's like we've been given a blueprint for building a strong, resilient marriage that can withstand anything life throws our way.
And while these principles provide a fantastic foundation, I'm curious to delve deeper into their practical application. How do we actually implement these principles in our daily lives?
That's a great question, and I think it's where the real work begins, because it's one thing to understand the principles, but it's another thing to put them into action.
So in part 2, we'll explore the practical side of these principles. We'll unpack some real-life scenarios and discuss actionable strategies for incorporating these principles into your daily life.
I'm looking forward to it.
We'll see you soon. Welcome back. So we've laid out this awesome framework for protecting your marriage with these 5 principles. Now I'm ready to get down to brass tacks. How do we actually put these principles into practice in our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's all well and good to talk about concepts, but the rubber meets the road when we start applying them to real-life situations.
Exactly. Like, we talked about guarding your words and seeking counsel wisely, but what does that look like when you're in the thick of a disagreement with your spouse and you just need to vent to someone?
Right. That's where discernment comes in.
Yeah.
It's about pausing before you pick up the phone or fire off that text to your best friend. Ask yourself, what am I hoping to achieve by sharing this? Am I looking for solutions or just validation for my anger?
So it's not that you can never vent to friends about marital struggles.
Nah.
It's more about being intentional.
Right. Think about it like this. If you have a medical issue, you don't just go around asking everyone for advice, right?
Yeah.
You go to a doctor, someone with expertise in that area.
Right.
The same principle applies to marriage.
Seek guidance from sources that align with the foundation of your relationship, like a trusted pastor, a Christian counselor, or a mentor couple with a solid track record.
And those folks are more likely to offer solutions rooted in the principles we're discussing, rather than just adding fuel to the fire of your frustration.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's say you've identified those wise counsel sources. How do you know when it's crossed the line from helpful venting to harmful oversharing? I mean, sometimes you just need to process your emotions, right?
Absolutely. We're not robots. We need to express our feelings. But here's a helpful litmus test. Ask yourself, if my spouse heard me talking like this, would they feel respected and loved?
That's a good one, because if your venting starts to sound disrespectful or demeaning towards your spouse, that's a red flag.
Exactly. And it also goes back to that idea of inviting outside influences into your marriage. When you overshare, you're essentially giving others permission to weigh in on your relationship dynamics, which can be really damaging.
Okay. I'm definitely feeling more equipped to navigate the guarding your words principle now. Let's switch gears to something a little more fun. Public affirmation. We talked about how it boosts your spouse's self-esteem, strengthens your bond, and even projects a united front to the world. But what are some concrete ways to put this into practice?
It doesn't have to be grand gestures or over-the-top pronouncements. Sometimes the most meaningful affirmations are those small, everyday moments of appreciation.
I love that. It's like noticing the things your spouse does well, and then verbalizing your appreciation.
Exactly. Like maybe your husband just fixed that leaky faucet that's been driving you crazy. Instead of saying, oh, thanks, You can say, "You're my hero. You're so handy. I'm so lucky to have you."
Right. Or maybe your wife just cooked an amazing dinner. You could tell her how much you appreciate the effort she put into it, how delicious it is, how talented she is in the kitchen.
And don't underestimate the power of nonverbal affirmation, too. A loving touch, a warm smile, holding hands across the table, these gestures speak volumes.
Speaking of nonverbal cues, I was reading an article the other day about the love languages, and it talked about how people express and receive love in different ways. Some people are all about words of affirmation, while others value acts of service or quality time.
That's such a crucial point. Public affirmation isn't one size fits all. It's about understanding your spouse's love language and tailoring your expressions of appreciation accordingly.
So if your spouse's love language is gifts, maybe you surprise them with a small token of your affection in front of others, or you tell a story about a thoughtful gift they gave you in the past.
And if their love language is quality time, maybe you make a point of planning a date night and inviting another couple to join you, showcasing your commitment to spending time together.
I love how we're connecting these principles to real-world examples and even secular research. It shows how these concepts are universally applicable, not just limited to a specific religious context.
Absolutely. The principles themselves are rooted in wisdom and a deep understanding of human relationships. And I think that's why they resonate with so many people, regardless of their background or beliefs.
Okay, so we've covered guarding our words in public affirmation. What about the principle of prioritizing your spouse's opinion? This one feels a bit trickier to navigate, especially when it comes to family dynamics.
You're right, it can be tough, especially when you're close to your family and value their opinions. But remember, marriage creates a new family unit, and that unit needs to have its own internal hierarchy.
So it's not about cutting off your family or dismissing their input altogether. It's more about establishing a clear understanding of where your primary loyalty lies.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Your spouse is your co-captain in this marriage ship. You need to be on the same page, making decisions together and navigating the course as a team.
Okay, that analogy really helps. So how do you handle situations where your family's opinions clash with your spouse's? Like, let's say your parents are pushing you to have kids, but you and your spouse aren't ready yet.
Well, that's where open communication and boundary setting comes in. You need to have a conversation with your parents, acknowledging their concerns, but also firmly stating that this is a decision you and your spouse will make together.
And that's where the presenting a united front principle kicks in, right?
Absolutely. You and your spouse need to be on the same page, presenting a united front to your family. And that unity sends a powerful message. We're a team. We respect your opinions, but ultimately, this is our decision to make.
And even if your family doesn't agree, the fact that you're standing together strengthens your bond and protects your marriage from outside pressure.
Exactly. It's like creating a force field around your marriage, deflecting any negativity or interference that comes your way.
Okay, this is all starting to click for me. So we've got clear communication, healthy boundaries, and a united front. How do we handle conflicts that inevitably arise within the marriage itself?
Well, that's where the presenting a united front principle takes on a slightly different nuance. Remember, it's not about pretending everything is perfect or avoiding conflict altogether. It's about choosing your battleground wisely.
So it's fine to disagree, to have different opinions, even to argue sometimes, but you do it in a way that protects the sanctity of your relationship, especially when others are around.
Exactly. Like, you're allowed to have a heated debate about whose turn it is to do the dishes, but you don't do it in front of your in-laws or at a dinner party with friends.
You save those conversations for a private moment when you can both express your feelings openly and honestly without an audience.
And even when you're disagreeing, you can still present a united front by focusing on the common ground. Instead of attacking each other, you focus on finding a solution together.
So it's like saying, hey, we may not see eye to eye on this particular issue, but we're both committed to working it out.
Right. And that commitment to working together, to honoring that covenant you made with each other and with God, is what ultimately protects your marriage.
It's about remembering that you're on the same team, even when you're facing tough challenges.
And that teamwork, that unity, is what makes you stronger and more resilient in the face of any external pressures or influences that come your way.
Okay, so we've unpacked the first four principles, but there's one more piece to this puzzle, shutting down negativity. This one seems pretty self-explanatory, but I'm sure there's some nuances we haven't explored yet.
You're right. It's not just about saying, don't talk bad about my spouse.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the insidious ways negativity can seep into your marriage and actively combating it.
So it's like having a zero tolerance policy for gossip, criticism, and any kind of negativity that threatens the peace and harmony of your relationship.
Exactly, and it starts with being mindful of your own words and actions. Are you contributing to the negativity? Are you complaining about your spouse to others?
Because sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it, right?
Right.
It's like we're so used to venting to our friends or family that we don't even stop to think about the impact it might be having on our marriage.
Right. We can unintentionally create a culture of negativity around our relationship without even realizing it. So the first step is to become aware of our own patterns and make a conscious effort to shift them.
So instead of focusing on what's wrong with our spouse, we choose to focus on what's right, on their positive qualities.
And when those negative thoughts creep in, we redirect them. We remind ourselves of all the reasons why we love and cherish our spouse.
It's like building up an immunity to negativity. We strengthen our resistance to those external influences that try to chip away at our bond.
Exactly. And the stronger our internal defenses, the less susceptible we are to outside attacks.
Okay, so we're being mindful of our own words and actions. What about when negativity comes from external sources? Like, what if a family member or friend starts criticizing our spouse or making negative comments about our marriage?
That's where we need to be assertive, but also compassionate. Remember, those people might not even realize they're being hurtful.
So instead of getting defensive or shutting them down completely, we can try to gently redirect the conversation.
Right. You could say something like, hey, I understand your perspective, but I really appreciate it if you could be more mindful of your words. My spouse is a really important part of my life, and I want to protect our relationship.
And if they continue to be negative, you might need to set some boundaries, like limiting your exposure to them or even having a more direct conversation about your concerns.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that you're not doing this to be mean or controlling. You're doing it to protect your marriage, which is a perfectly valid and healthy thing to do.
So it's like saying, hey, I love you, but I also love my spouse, and I need to prioritize our relationship.
Precisely. And true friends and family members will understand and respect that.
Okay, this has been such a practical and eye-opening discussion. I'm already starting to see how these seemingly simple principles can have a profound impact on the strength and resilience of a marriage.
Me too. It's like we've been given a toolkit for building a fortress around our relationship, protecting it from those external forces that can sometimes threaten to tear it apart.
And what I love is that these principles are adaptable to any relationship, whether you're newlyweds or you've been married for decades.
Absolutely. They're timeless principles rooted in wisdom and a deep understanding of human connection. And the more we intentionally apply them, the stronger and more fulfilling our marriages will be.
This has been such an incredible conversation. We've covered so much ground already, from understanding the 5 principles to exploring practical ways to implement them in our daily lives. But there's one area we haven't dived into yet that I think is crucial to protecting your marriage:
And what's that?
boundaries. I'm talking about creating those healthy boundaries that define where your marriage ends and external influences begin. It's about building that safe space where your bond can truly thrive.
Ah, yes, boundaries. Absolutely essential. You know, it's like building a fence around your garden to protect your precious plants from pests and weeds.
Exactly. And while that sounds simple enough, I think it's one of the most challenging aspects of protecting your marriage because it often involves saying no to people we love, setting limits with those who might be used to having unlimited access to our lives.
You're right. It can be incredibly tough, especially when it comes to family dynamics and long-standing friendships. But it's also one of the most rewarding aspects of protecting your marriage because it creates a space for true intimacy and connection to flourish.
So in this final part, we're going to dive deep into the power of boundaries. We'll explore practical strategies for setting healthy limits, navigating tricky situations, and gracefully communicating your needs to others.
Sounds good.
So where do we even begin building those boundaries, I mean?
Well, I think it starts with identifying the areas where you feel your marriage is most vulnerable.
Okay.
You know, it's different for every couple, but it often comes down to time, decision-making, and emotional energy.
Okay, so time, maybe you and your spouse are feeling overwhelmed because you're constantly being pulled in different directions by friends and family, leaving little time for yourselves.
Exactly. Or maybe you're facing a big decision as a couple: finances, parenting choices, career moves, and you're getting bombarded with unsolicited advice from everyone under the sun. It can feel like everyone's got an opinion, and it's hard to hear your own inner compass amidst all the noise.
And then there's the emotional energy drain. Like maybe one of your siblings is going through a tough time and constantly leans on you for support, which is great, but it leaves you emotionally depleted and unable to fully show up for your spouse.
Right. Those are all great examples of where boundaries can make a huge difference. So once you've identified those vulnerable areas, the next step is to actually start setting those boundaries.
Okay, easier said than done, right? I imagine some people get really anxious about the thought of having to sit down with their loved ones and say, hey, here are all the new rules for interacting with me and my marriage.
You don't have to make it a big formal announcement. Sometimes it's as simple as making small adjustments to your routine. Like maybe your mom calls every single day, and while you love talking to her, those daily calls are cutting into your quality time as a couple.
So instead of picking up every time she calls, you let it go to voicemail sometimes and call her back later when you have more time to chat. Or maybe you suggest a weekly call instead of daily to create more space in your schedule.
Exactly. It's about finding those little tweaks that create more breathing room in your marriage without completely shutting people out.
And what about those trickier situations where you need to set firmer boundaries? Like, let's say your in-laws have a habit of dropping by unannounced, and it always seems to be right when you and your spouse are finally having some alone time.
Right. In those cases, you might need to have a more direct conversation.
Right.
But remember, it doesn't have to be confrontational. You can approach it with love and understanding while also being clear about your needs.
So you could say something like, hey, we love seeing you guys, but we've realized that we really value having some predictable downtime as a couple. Would you mind giving us a heads up before you come over next time? It would really help us create some space for ourselves.
Exactly. And if they push back or don't seem to respect your boundaries, you might need to be a little firmer. Remember, you're allowed to say no. You're allowed to prioritize your marriage, even if it means disappointing someone else.
I think a lot of people struggle with that, especially women. We're often conditioned to be people pleasers, to put everyone else's needs before our own.
It's true, but saying no isn't selfish, it's self-care. And when you prioritize your marriage, you're actually investing in the well-being of everyone involved, because a strong, healthy marriage creates a ripple effect of positivity that extends outward to your family, your friends, and even your community.
So it's like a win-win situation. You're creating a happier, more fulfilling marriage, and you're modeling healthy boundaries for those around you.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that research has shown that couples who are able to establish and maintain healthy boundaries tend to have higher levels of marital satisfaction. They report feeling more connected to each other, more supported, and less stressed.
So it's not just a touchy-feely concept. It's backed by science. Okay, so we've talked about identifying vulnerable areas, making small adjustments, having those direct conversations, and being okay with saying no. What are some other practical tips for setting boundaries?
One thing that's really helpful is to be proactive. Don't wait until you're feeling resentful or overwhelmed to start setting boundaries. Talk to your spouse about your needs and expectations early on and create a plan for how you'll handle those tricky situations together.
Like maybe you know that holidays are always stressful because both of your families have different traditions and expectations. So you sit down with your spouse and decide in advance how you'll divide your time, how you'll communicate your plans to each family, and how you'll support each other when those inevitable conflicts arise.
Exactly. Having a plan in place helps you stay calm and united when those challenging moments inevitably pop up.
And it also sends a message to your families that you and your spouse are a team, that you're making decisions together, and that you're prioritizing your marriage.
Right, it's about presenting that united front we talked about earlier, which discourages people from trying to play divide and conquer.
Okay, I love how all these principles are interconnected, how they build on each other to create this incredibly strong framework for protecting your marriage.
It's like weaving a tapestry, each thread representing a different principle, all coming together to create this beautiful, resilient work of art.
And boundaries are those strong, supportive threads that hold everything together. They create the space for the other principles to flourish, for love, communication, and intimacy to thrive.
Beautifully said. And what's really fascinating is that the concept of boundaries isn't just limited to marriage. It's essential in all relationships, with friends, family, coworkers, even with ourselves.
That's a great point. It's about respecting our own limits, honoring our needs, and communicating them clearly to others. And when we do that, we create healthier, more fulfilling relationships all around.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding where everyone's needs are valued and honored.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into protecting your marriage, I want to leave you with this thought. Boundaries are not walls. They're not meant to shut people out or create distance in your relationships.
They're more like gates, allowing the right people in at the right time, creating a safe and nurturing space where your marriage can truly flourish.
And remember, building healthy boundaries is an ongoing process. It takes time, communication, and a willingness to prioritize your marriage above all else.
But the rewards are immeasurable. A strong, protected marriage filled with love, intimacy, and joy. A marriage that reflects the beauty and resilience of the covenant you made with each other and with God.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical tools to strengthen and protect your own marriage. May your journey be filled with love, grace, and an abundance of blessings.